I think everyone just knows that things don't always work out in the real world. No matter how hard you try, things can't always be fixed. And the simple act of trying sometimes makes things far worse. I think everyone has had such experiences, and when you experience that kind of letdown again and again, then after a while, whenever anything happens, you find yourself thinking, trying just makes everything hurt worse. What's the point of trying then? Deciding from the very start that there's nothing you can do is easier. It hurts less. All those experiences of failure and disappointment, they put the brakes on any positive thought you might have. Negativity gets so deep into your heart, and it's difficult to get it out again. The self-fulfilling prophecy describes a process in which reality conforms to an initial belief, such that the perceived veracity of that belief increases indirectly due to its existence. Person A believes person B is rude and unpleasant, perhaps having overheard other people talking about B. As a consequence of this belief, A interacts with B in a curt and hostile manner, causing B to respond in a way that matches A's initial expectations of B. So is person B rude and unpleasant? Well, person A is likely to think so, having a pre-existing explanation for B's abrasive behavior, and thus never needing to consider that it was A's actions in the first place that led quite reasonably to B's response. The worst part about interactions like these is that because they reinforce the original belief, the probability of future interactions with B ending the same way for the same reasons also increases, creating a feedback loop which continually reinforces the original unsubstantiated belief. To me, the self-fulfilling prophecy is amongst the most humbling of psychological phenomena. It tells us that phrases like mind over matter and perception is reality are more than cliché or platitude. The self-fulfilling prophecy shows us that our thoughts can reshape the world. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity is first and foremost concerned with self-fulfilling prophecies and their power. Most accurately, it's concerned with the contents of that initial belief, and what it might mean for us. In Gates, the psyches of Pokémon manifest themselves concretely within the world. Pokémon are given a spokesman in the form of the Voice of Life, while their negative emotions weave together the bitter cold. This is effectively Gates removing the middleman in the self-fulfilling prophecy. The thoughts and feelings of Pokémon don't only lead them to take actions, those same thoughts and feelings have direct consequences on the state of the world. Gates to Infinity genuinely believes emotions have that kind of power. Consequently, the game prioritizes the inner states of its characters as the nucleus of the story. Remember that scene with the partner in Grovyle watching the sunset in Explorers? Rhetorical question, of course you do. Well, that kind of scene is standard procedure here. Gates to Infinity is likely the closest Pokémon will ever get to a full-on soap opera. The game is constantly needling its characters for emotional conflicts and interpersonal theatrics. Near the midpoint of Gates, the team resolves to use Umbreon and Espeon's Enter cards for an expedition to the Great Glacier, a snow-covered, crevice-filled region which has never been successfully explored. But just as we're getting ready, the game throws a curveball. Quagsire informs us that Happy, the organization the team reports under, requires at least one of the registered team members to occupy home base at all times. What follows is a nearly 30-minute angst session in which the members of Paradise agonize over who is going to have to miss out on the adventure of a lifetime. Virizion can't let Dunsparce stay behind because he confided in her the previous night how important going to the Great Glacier would be to proving himself a capable member of the team. And Emolga can't let Dunsparce stay behind because he was secretly eavesdropping on their conversation. But neither Dunsparce nor Emolga can let Virizion stay behind because the Great Glacier is where her friend Keldea went missing, who also wrote a mysterious note saying he only went to the Great Glacier as an excuse to finally get away from her. So in their indecisiveness, the group decides to leave the decision to chance, but when pulling straws eventually chooses Dunsparce anyways, which Dunsparce reluctantly accepts against their team's further protests, Emolga makes a last-minute sacrifice at the Magna Gate to allow his friend the expedition he deserves. My goodness, someone needs to tell these people to start a drama channel or something. The Paradise situation is crazy. If it sounds like I'm making fun of the game, you couldn't be more wrong. This schmaltzy melodrama is by far Gates' most endearing quality. As I'm sure you noticed, getting this into the heads of the characters is entirely unlike what most Pokémon stories are usually interested in. Generally speaking, scenes in Pokémon games are very functional. good at ensuring each dialogue exchange offers some hint of progression, whether that be by setting up a new objective, teaching you about a mechanic, or expounding on some crucial plot detail. But what's most striking about this pre-Glacier sequence is that it's pretty much pointless. The only reason this conflict comes about is because of some random bureaucratic red tape the game never mentioned before and will never mention again after. It doesn't lead to any novel gameplay segments, it doesn't advance the ongoing plot in any significant way, nor is it really all that essential to any of the characters' arcs. You could remove this shortest straw story wholesale and the game would proceed in just about the same way it does now. This conflict only exists because Gates thinks it's important enough to stop everything in its tracks and see how our characters will respond to an interesting dilemma. It's hardly the only time the game puts its foot on the brakes. During one of the final dungeons, our exploration of the Eastern Spire is repeatedly halted to give us little scenes of all the characters, from Espeon wondering why Umbreon would downplay the danger they're in, to Virizion confronting Emolga on whether he hates her. I mean, what kind of Pokemon game is this? I'm inclined to say it's a very good Pokemon game. Gates' interest in and commitment to its own characters is genuinely refreshing, and kind of infectious. I do actually want to know whether Emolga hates Virizion. It helps that, despite its soapiness, Gates wisely steers clear of the obnoxious tropes that can make this type of drama feel tedious. There are no comedic misunderstandings or half-heard sentences, jealousy-laden love triangles, overreactive fallings out, or surprise pregnancies. Okay, maybe that's one trope we didn't need to be so worried about happening. The point is, Gates does a competent job rooting its small little dramas in believable conflicts pertaining to what these characters are interested in and what they believe. In other words, Gates has good drama. It is no surprise, then, that by Gates' closing credits, it has managed to build out the most compelling cast of characters in all of the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series, or frankly, in any Pokémon game ever. There are, of course, plenty of individual characters from other Pokémon games I find equally, if not more, engrossing, but certainly no game has been as thorough as Gates in characterizing all its main personalities. A ways into the team's expedition of the glacier, they come across little ice capsules called Frisms. These containers are able to hold the voice of a person who speaks into them, just until someone reopens the capsule and lets the voice out. Think of it as a temporary message in a bottle. The Frisms are yet another frivolous invention of Gates, not plot relevant strictly speaking, nor some kind of item to be used by the player, but truly only as a device meant to sap out every last ounce of drama from its characters. A Frism in the Glacier Palace holds remnants of Keldeo's voice, causing Virizion more grief. One scene, though, sticks out to me most. Upon returning from the glacier, Emolga pulls a prank using his Frism outside our house. He tells us how much he enjoys these little objects. It's a small, insignificant scene, which exists merely to show that Emolga is appreciative that we bothered to think of him during our adventure. It's these small beats that make the characters enjoyable to learn more about. Much like the Frisms themselves, little was requiring Gates to include a scene like this, but it's all the better for it. Considering the game's overall proclivities, is it really any surprise Gates should make such a minor, inconsequential trophy the centerpiece of its title card? Much in line with previous Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games, Gates to Infinity is transfixed on the inherent wonders of the world. Post Town seems to be the confluence of many of these wonders, a small outpost known for its pristine waters. Herdier reminisces about a pattern of overlapping rainbows which often appear to top the town's tallest hill. Mirages of the Great Glacier often appear on that same hill, inviting adventurers to take their shot at braving the cold. In the heart of the glacier lies a palace of naturally formed sculptures buried underneath a dome of frozen ice. Umbreon and Espeon are researchers interested in investigating a crystal found within the glacier, known to have the ability to make objects levitate. In the world of Mystery Dungeon, ley lines are not a thing of pseudo-archaeology. They are real, tangible connections between the world's self-conceived wonders, which can be manipulated and twisted to travel great distances in short periods of time, the idea underlying Magna Gates. Mechanically, Gates does a better job than any other PMD at emphasizing a world in motion. Latent patterns in the atmosphere, called V-waves, grant advantages to different types of Pokemon. Victini acts as the town's meteorologist, giving you the 10-day V-wave forecast on demand. Mysteriosity is a curious term thrown around on a frequent basis to explain the appearance of mystery dungeons. In the post-game, mysteriosity manifests itself as a random effect on some floors. Each location is assigned an inherent mysteriosity value, denoting the likelihood of a random event occurring. Most interesting, though, is when Gates breaks the promise at the core of the series and creates bespoke, non-randomly generated zones for a few of the marquee dungeons. Some of these areas contain light puzzles, like searching out for the right flower within an Inflora forest, but most of them are simply scenic little paths. A little flourish to visually and atmospherically differentiate dungeons, from the giant ravine looming below an ochre quarry, or the spotted cliffs on the aptly named Hole Hills. This extension of the world's strange capabilities is no accident. It is precisely the intersection between the world's mysteriosity and the game's broader focus on the inner turmoil of its characters where Gates to Infinity finds the source of its conflict. The world from appearances looks beautiful, right? Only the characters don't seem to agree on that point. Bright balls of light rise up into the sky from Post Town. Mysterious, but not exactly out of line with a place that also experiences mirages, overlapping rainbows and V-waves. Nevertheless, the residents don't seem to appreciate the show. I've lived in this town my whole life, and I have never seen anything like that before. Not once. And now these things keep showing up, and pretty often too. It just makes me kinda uneasy. Yeah, folks are always saying stuff, right? Like it's a bad omen or something. The more mysterious and strange things that happen, I can't help feeling like it's some kind of sign of bad things to come. It's a disparity between appearances and attitude the game makes frequently, a disparity which immediately sets Gates apart from its predecessor. Explorers showed us a place where mystery dungeons were good to be traded. Dungeons were opportunities for discoveries and adventure, which the land provided, filling its deepest corners with ancient ruins and treasure chests galore. Expedition teams were dime a dozen, and those that managed to traverse dangerous and exotic locations became local celebrities. In Explorers, the mysteriosity of the world was the people's calling, their passion, their anticipation, their bragging rights. But for the characters in Gates, mysteriosity is anything but appealing. It is a threat, equal parts dangerous and annoying, a sign of instability and uncertainty. Quagsire cites the spread of mystery dungeons as a cause for strained relationships between Pokémon. He also implies the increase in mystery dungeons has decreased the value proposition of the land the partner wants to buy, noting, "You can't count on anything going as expected in this kind of place, The world in turn works to satisfy the expectations of its people. The rainbows of hope vanish without a trace, leaving the people coming to Post Town to see it high and dry. If they believe that mystery dungeons are nothing more than hostile architecture, then that is what they will be. The very first dungeon we see in Gates is little more than an inconvenient roadblock preventing the partner from getting to his meeting with Quagsire on time. The Pokémon of Gates see very little beauty in the world. Developing this view of mysteriosity is just one piece of the puzzle Gates is trying to construct. It's part and parcel with an aim to show us a people suffering from pervasive mistrust. To that end, Gates to Infinity is the PMD game which most effectively and consistently winds its subplots around its thematic backbone. Virizion becomes jaded and distrustful towards Pokémon after her preconceived notions about Keldea's personality are thrown into disarray following his breakup letter. When a love-stricken Dunsparce is rejected by Virizion for being too weak, the Poniard brothers attempt to persuade Dunsparce into taking the red pill. Naturally, it's all a scam to steal Dunsparce's money. Flyers warning of dangerous Pokémon lurking near Post Town put the people on edge. Despite being a town designed for weary travelers, the residents regard outsiders with suspicion. A collapsed Umbreon is subject to a debate on his trustworthiness. He could just be pretending to be hurt, you know? Then once everyone's let their guard down, that's when he'll strike. I don't know, he doesn't look like a bad guy, but, well, he's not from around here, right? So we don't know for sure. Later, we get duped ourselves, betrayed by the Pokémon we thought we were meant to save. In reality, the scene of Munna being attacked by Hydreigon was an imaginary scenario planted in the player's mind to lure us to her. Eventually, the pessimistic attitudes of Pokémon begin to take their toll, coagulating into the bitter cold, a symbol of negativity's corrosiveness on the world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The bitter cold is hardly necessary to understand Gates' point about negativity. The game presents its strongest example first, in what I can only call the best first hour to any Pokémon game that's ever been released. Gates works quickly to inculcate us to the dour state of affairs between Pokémon. Our first challenge upon purchasing the land deed from Quagsire is finding a place to sleep that's not the exposed outdoors. We land on the passerby carpenter in Post Town, Girder, for his help in building a house. He agrees, on the condition we bring him gems to trade materials for the project. In fact, it is really us falling for the first scam of the game. Girder has a Scrafty lying in wait, ready to buy the gems for a small sum of poke Girder can take for himself. Unlike the Poniard brothers, who were simple 2-bit crooks looking for a payday, Gates has considerably more to say about this scenario. Girder's scheme gives us a good idea as to why Gates thinks negativity is so toxic. It's likely to create more of the same behavior later on. After each interaction with Girder, his coworkers seem desperate to warn us of what we're getting into. They just can't bring themselves to do it. They still cling onto the hope that Girder's mind can be changed and that they can get back to the job they used to enjoy doing. And so Girder's behavior becomes multiple people's problem. He's made his whole operation complicit alongside him. However, the toxic spiral extends backwards in time as well. After sustaining a back injury, the quality of Girder's work slowly declined. He watched his skills slip away from him job after job, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then one day, a client trashed his work and destroyed it in front of his face. But the client didn't do it because he thought it was bad or against specifications. He destroyed the house because that was what he had intended to do from the start. He did it because he could. Girder's passion vanished after that. It's the same confounding experience the game suggests Virizion went through with Keldeo, a moment of bewildering cruelty that destroys your faith in the world, that leaves you with a crippling uncertainty. That feeling of stunned disbelief, and the desire to keep believing anyway, those feelings become jumbled up until you don't know what to trust anymore. Why pretend to be missing when you know the people who care about you will exert all their energy on a rescue? Why have someone build a house if you know you're just gonna tear it down right after? Why choose to make someone suffer when there's nothing to be gained from it? The answer to that question is the initial belief. If you really think the world is full of cheaters, thieves, and liars, you'll start to act in ways consistent with that belief. You might regard people skeptically. You might think you need to hurt someone else before they can hurt you. You might come to think that everything you're doing is perfectly alright. How can anyone blame you for defending yourself? Honest folk just look like fools. In a world like this, you're the ones who get blamed for being tricked. So you can't get mad at me. It's just the way this rotten world works. And when all is said and done, who remaining will want to interact with you except for all the other cheaters, thieves, and liars who believe exactly the same as you do? In the end, your world may actually be nothing but rotten people. Girder reaches up to the starry sky, outstretching his arm. Still, his body can't quite move the way it should. That's life. Gates to Infinity proposes a solution to the problem of the self-fulfilling prophecy, perhaps the only solution to the problem. Contrasted to the residents of Post Town, the partner sees mysteriosity not as something to be feared, but as an invitation to be embraced wholeheartedly. There are lots of mysteries in this world, but the truth is that maybe those things aren't really all that mysterious at all. Maybe they're just things I don't know about yet, and that's why they seem mysterious. The mystery dungeons are spreading around here. You never know what might happen on a land like this. There are a lot of Pokemon who hate that kind of uncertainty. But to me, it just means an exciting adventure could sprout up at any time. The partner represents the traditional Pokémon Mystery Dungeon ethos in a game largely devoid of it. His openness to uncertainty applies just as much to people as it does the mystery dungeons. If Girder's behavior showed that negativity is a falling tide which sinks all, the partner shows that positivity works in the opposite way. Immediately after hearing Girder's tale, it only steels his resolve. The partner becomes absolutely determined Girder should be the one to build our house. It was a random act of cruelty that began this cycle, and it is a random act of kindness which will break it. The partner defies Girder's expectations about the world with a single proposition, a proposition of genuine interest in Girder's well-being. That the partner would rather live in a pile of garbage built by someone who believes in it than a masterpiece built by someone only trying to get a job done. That he would accept something worse for himself if it meant rekindling the passion of the person who made it. This is the partner's modus operandi. Placing your trust in someone is an inherently virtuous activity because it will inspire that person to make good on that trust. He lays out the idea explicitly to Verizon. I know there are a lot of dishonest Pokemon out there these days, but if you don't take that first step, then no one else is ever going to open up and trust you either, are they? The exchange reveals the partner's disposition as more than childish naivete. He is fully cognizant of the fact that choosing to trust in people will not always work, that it may very well lead him into trouble as it did with Girder. The partner simply argues that this is an acceptable risk, maybe even a vitally important risk to take. It is fitting then that a game about how we all play a part in shaping reality centrally revolves around constructing our own paradise. Unlike in other mystery dungeons where we join some pre-existing institution, like the Guild and Explorers or the Expedition Society and Super, Gates leaves us to start from scratch. There's no Loudred to wake us up in the morning. We're responsible for finding our own Pokemon to join Paradise and slowly build up the team we would have been automatically assigned to in other games. In that sense, the assemblage of Paradise is more like your stereotypical JRPG, slowly accruing party members over the course of the game. We must also tend to the land in Paradise. Gates to Infinity offers the most inventive gameplay loop in PMD, where you bring Girder materials from requests to develop different plots of land and later facilities. This includes fields to grow more berries and seeds, dojos to train up moves of different types, lotteries, various shopping vendors that sell specialty items, and Starmie-based diving minigames. While Gates similarly devotes most of the first half of the game to building Paradise, a satisfying narrative structure which I talked more about in my Explorers video, I have to say I found this premise so interesting I was almost disappointed when a new story segment showed up. The sheer number of options in what to build meant there was always a concrete goal to work towards. And when you see something like Beartick Slide appear in the construction menu, well, you just have to see what the heck that is, right? It's another little mini-game in case you were wondering. Of course, not everything is sunshine and rainbows in Paradise. Everyone and their mother has said this about Gates to Infinity, and unfortunately it's a critique I must echo as well. I simply see no good reason to limit you to only one request per day. What I don't often hear is why this is so frustrating. The reason is because it dramatically hinders the acquisition of new materials for building. Since most requests end up only giving 2 different kinds of materials, and only 1 or 2 of each at most, even the smallest task of repainting your windows can become a Herculean effort. And when you see just how many materials are required to upgrade some of these facilities, the math on how many days that will take quickly becomes daunting. Suddenly, a pink roof is less a customization option and more a waste of my time. Why would I use up a day on that when I could be working towards a Reviver Seed field? And because Gates is relatively light on post-game content compared to other mystery dungeons, by game's end, you've barely had an opportunity to engage with the Paradise building at all. I only just prepared my 4th of 8 land plots after beating the post-game story, and I didn't manage to upgrade a single facility my entire playthrough. This is a shame, because Paradise building is a great enough core loop to sustain the game for much longer. Thematically, it should be a bigger part of the game than it is. Though the partner represents an idealistic force within the story, Gates to Infinity implies that his desire to build Paradise is motivated in part by a fundamental insecurity. One evening, the partner confides to us that he has always been lonely. No family to turn to, friends to laugh with. He tried, but no one says what they mean. It's all just lies and lip service. I just can't live like that. He continues, emphasizing the difference between him and Verizon. But you know, at least I never stopped looking. Not just for some superficial alliance, but for someone I could trust with the real me. Rooted deep into the partner is the idea that his assumptions about the world are totally wrong. The world is not a fundamentally good place, and to place your faith in another is exactly as foolish an idea as Girder or Verizon suggest. Thus, Paradise must be constructed to prove his assertion correct, to quash any bit of doubt in his mind once and for all. Gates does think the partner is onto something here. The basis of hope for the rest of the characters in Paradise does not come from themselves in isolation. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Their hope is based around an attachment to someone else. This explains why Gates is so adamant to match characters in pairs. Dunsparce with Emolga, Umbreon with Espeon, and Verizon with Keldeo. Pertinent to that last pairing, after finding the Frizzum with Keldeo's voice recorded on it, Verizon reassesses her behavior. She claims that meeting the rest of the group and hearing a voice altogether different from the Keldeo that wrote the letter has convinced her to start believing again, and that the only reason she turned cold in the first place was herself. Hope, Gates argues, has to latch onto someone. It makes a great deal of sense why the partner emphasizes the impacts of Girder's behavior on the Timber. If he loses the only people still sticking by him, what hope is left? Doubt remained inside the partner because he never found anyone else he could trust. So when he discovers the player, it is a complete paradigm shift. Vindication at last. The player is the first piece of evidence he's ever gotten that his hypothesis of the world is not wrong. Paradise is finally being built, just as he imagined it. It should be enough to finally topple that last drop of anxiety, right? Not at all. The partner's insecurity only seems to intensify. In one scene, he considers the possibility that we might choose to return to the human world after resolving the mystery behind that strange dream. Then he forces us into an impossible promise. If you don't know what to do, I think you should stay here forever. Please, just stay here with us forever, okay? It's a request absolutely dripping with desperation. The partner characters have always been fairly clingy, but this is a whole new level. It's easy to see how the partner might come to this. After spending his whole life searching for someone to believe in, losing that seems utterly unconscionable. If he loses the player after all this, won't that prove no amount of trust in the world can produce a lasting friendship? So we see the utopia the partner has really created is a paradise of glass. One small upset and the whole illusion shatters, until the seed of doubt is set firmly back in place. Gates is clearly uncomfortable with the partner's demands. That, on some level, the partner is engaging in the same selfish behavior he spends the entire game fighting against. That his paradise is in actuality made up of just as much lies and lip service as the friends he could never make. This anxiety crops up again when we're on the run from Muna. Thanks to her implanted dreams, the player and partner initially perceived Hydreigon to be a monstrous threat. In reality, Hydreigon is a polite fellow, spending his time correcting any misconceptions we may have about him, endearingly referring to the partner as Sir, and apologizing profusely when he forgets to pay his bills. But the game presents an opposing account on Hydreigon's seemingly jolly personality. Kirim warns that Hydreigon, as the voice of life, is only interested in the player and partner insofar as it can use them for its benefit. That its desire to see the world's destruction from the bitter cold stayed is a consequence of it being nothing more than the self-serving will of this world. Nobody says what they mean, the partner opined, and maybe that's true of Hydreigon as well. The partner admits that after we got pummeled by Kirim, the only thing he could imagine was us being enveloped and taken back to the human world. So what are we to believe then? Does the partner really want to build a Pokémon paradise? Or is this just a self-interested personal playground where he can finally have someone all to himself? We finally get our answer in that same scene. The exigency of the bitter cold at hand, the partner is directly confronted on his motives. Should he pursue the bitter cold, Kirim would assuredly return to harm the player, as he so eloquently promised a scene prior. But should he choose not to pursue the bitter cold, he could keep the player safe at the expense of the rest of the world. The partner's decision is that paradise has to be enough for him. Paradise is first-hand proof that even if he can't have that perfect friend he envisions, his hypothesis isn't wrong. That if you make the first step to trust, it will rouse others to do the same. The partner finally admits in his last frism to us how selfish the request was. He figures, because we're human, there must be people waiting on the other side of the divide for us. Which means his request was basically an admission that he was fine depriving those people of someone they cared about just so he could keep you instead. His final request for us: have a good life. In the postgame, we see another example of the partner's hypothesis paying off. Keldeo finds his conviction so infectious, he decides to stay in Post Town and help build paradise. When the partner says it, you really feel like it could happen. Strange, huh? What we're witnessing is the self-fulfilling prophecy again. The partner believed that the world could be more than cheaters, thieves, and liars. He acted in ways consistent with that belief, by choosing to put his faith in people like Girder or Virizion, and they in turn reciprocated his behavior, forming the foundation of paradise. And prophecy is the right word to choose here. This is the lens through which Gates understands the passage of fate, a concept the game throws around a lot in the second half. Gates is certain fate is only what the people believe it to be. Kiram claims that fate means destruction at the hands of the bitter cold, but he also tells us why the bitter cold came about in the first place. It is because people simply didn't care. They didn't care about their friends, they didn't care about their neighbors, they didn't care about making the world a better place. They see the world around them crumble and they think, there's nothing I can do about that, so why should I care at all? Kiram must protect this destruction. His only role as the guardian of fate is to give the people what they want, and the bitter cold is their answer. But if fate is created in such a way, then surely a change in belief can also be the seed of inspiration which alters its flow, no? That is the paradox of the self-fulfilling prophecy. It is either the basis of or the solution to our problems. Luna's gang is a dark mirror to the crew we form, a group assembled to ensure the world's demise. A reminder that, though we are the builders of paradise, so too are we the architects of our own destruction. After learning the truth of the bitter cold, Paradise attempts to convince the Pokémon of Post Town that the only way to stop the world's destruction is to believe the outcome will be different. The plea falls mostly on deaf ears. When Emolga expresses frustration at Post Town's lack of resolve, Verizon gives that familiar explanation. Trying just makes everything hurt worse. It is without a doubt the most dangerous form of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas, in all the other examples of the prophecy we saw, beliefs had an indirect effect on reality, the belief that even the act of trying has lost its value has a more sinister impact. It is a version of the prophecy most analogous to the bitter cold. If trying does nothing, you will act in a manner consistent with that belief. Doing nothing. If you do nothing, the problems in your life will only continue to fester and swirl until they become catastrophic. In a way, it's sort of comforting. At least you can see it coming. A truly predetermined future, safe from any uncertainty or mysteriosity that might veer you wildly off course. It could be said that a world which accepts the uselessness of trying is much like Muna herself, suicidal. The post-game returns to the partner's dilemma. The rules which govern the universe dictated that the player character had to be sent back to their world for the stability of the cosmos. But if mere thoughts can alter the flow of fate, why not change destiny again? Deny the rules of the universe, impose our will, and do the impossible. Bring the player back. Hydreigon posits it's a perfectly plausible theory. But the partner, having learned his lesson, is deeply concerned with the implications. He didn't need to let us go because of universal order. He needed to do it because it was the moral thing to do. What right does he have to dictate someone else's agency for himself? So when Hydreigon and the partner venture deep into the world core to test the group's hypothesis, the partner stipulates that if we are to return, we must be able to freely move between the two worlds. Otherwise, no deal. And then something clever happens. When the moment arrives and fate is defied once more, Gates to Infinity remembers the partner's respect for our agency and does what no other Pokémon Mystery Dungeon has ever bothered to do. It asks us whether we'd like to return. If you've seen my other Pokémon Mystery Dungeon videos, it should come as no surprise when I say I have a preference for the 3DS entries of the series. I like their more expansive view on the setting of these games, where rescue and exploration teams are not the be-all end-all for basically every Pokémon. Post Town is a prime example. Divorced from any such guilds or societies, the town can exist for more than the operation of such places, allowing for a whole range of more mundane personalities and occupations. Innkeeps, carpenters, wandering salesmen, or ordinary residents taking in the sights at the top of the hill. And buildings don't all have to be shaped like the Pokémon who run them, out of some unnecessary obligation to remind us whom the world is inhabited by. Gates vaguely references other settlements, from Scraggy selling his gems out west, or Emolga wanting to visit other towns to try and warn people of the bitter cold. Even though the story remains situated in one location, Post Town isn't the center of the universe. It is just one of many. This is the virtue of creating a more holistic world. It expands the number of possible perspectives on familiar material. The weariness Pokémon have towards mystery dungeons in this game is in some sense a function of this approach. They simply have other things going on in their lives than peeling off requests from a board all week. It would be quite difficult to imagine Gates pulling off a similar story as successfully if it took place in a setting like Treasure Town. Why would a place full of people who want to become expert explorers be upset about mysteriosity? As such, Gates makes us privy to a more three-dimensional view of how mystery dungeons are perceived within its own universe. Three-dimensional would be a good way to describe the game as a whole. I'm not just talking about the fact Gates is using 3D models on the 3DS either. Owing to what I've said before, it is legitimately surprising how responsive the game is to its characters and their tribulations. Espeon explains how she was able to escape capture by Muna's gang. But the heart of the scene is really that Espeon feels horrible for endangering a child to protect herself. That's just not the kind of moral nuance you expect a Pokemon game to care about. Other elements are similarly purposeful. Gates, unlike prior mystery dungeons, chooses to concern itself with the partner's parentage and history to ground out his conflict. And the Frisms are used so sparingly throughout the game, you wonder if they were only included specifically so Gates could pull off the most heartbreaking farewell scene in the series. It's strange. Gates to Infinity seems tailor-made to build a cult following. The focus on smaller character narratives and emotional melodrama, tied together by a strong thematic core, ought to be the perfect recipe for drawing in a certain subset of people. The kind of people that might be interested in starting forum threads about their favorite character, or, hypothetically, making video essays on their interpretation of the game's story. Indeed, the last time the third entry of a beloved spin-off series from a popular Nintendo-published franchise paired drama-filled character stories with controversial new gameplay changes, it was called Super Paper Mario. Now there's a game with a dedicated fanbase. And yet it's clear Gates to Infinity has utterly failed to cultivate a similar kind of audience. No one cares about Gates. That's too bad, because it's hardly the lesser mystery dungeon it's been billed as. By some metrics, I'd argue it's some of the best and most experimental stuff this entire franchise has given us. I know I'd certainly like to see a base management-like feature return in some way, or preset environments to add puzzles and dungeons. So in the future, I'd like to see the game's fortunes change for the better. I think I'll start by speaking a good word about its virtues. After all, if Gates to Infinity has taught me anything, spreading that initial belief far enough may just allow my wish to become reality.